France's litany of deadly attacks continues this Thursday. An attacker with a knife has killed 3 people, decapitating 1 woman, police sources say. Anti-terrorism investigations are currently underway in the city of Nice. Also coming up on our programme at this hour, France announces a new lockdown to fight the second wave of COVID-19. Emmanuel Macron says one exception is schools, which will stay open. We'll have more on those measures later this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Paris time. Those are our top stories at this hour on France 24. Thank you so much for joining us. We start with breaking news this Thursday from the southern city of Nice in France. According to police sources, 3 people are reported to have been killed in a knife attack and several injured at a church in the city centre. They say 1 woman was decapitated. Now, the attacker has been detained while anti-terrorism prosecutors investigate the onslaught. This comes as France is under high alert for terrorist acts amid tensions over the publication of caricatures of the Muslim prophet Muhammad and after 2 other recent attacks. Of course, we'll bring you updates on this story as they come in. Now, for more, I'd like to bring in Bernard Louis. He's the founder of Chrysotech, which is a crisis management consultancy firm here in France. Thank you so much for being with us this Thursday. Here we are again. Another attack in France at a time when the country, as I just mentioned, is already on high alert. I hate to say this, but I suppose this doesn't come as a surprise, does it?
Sadly, no, it doesn't. There are tensions between a very small minority of the Muslim population and the authorities in France, but there is a higher tension between other external forces and the authorities in France. Of course, as you must remember, the Turkish President Erdogan has taken the liberties of insulting the French president after the president expressed his support for the showing of the caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad by Samuel Paty, by the teacher that was sadly decapitated 2 weeks ago. And so the tensions are very high. And of course, the terrorist threat has possibly never been higher since the waves of attacks in 2015 and 2016 in Paris. And of course, in Nice, sadly, today it's in Nice again. So the symbol is very, very strong, and the symbol that was very strong to decapitate a teacher in front of his high school 2 weeks ago. This time the symbol is very strong as well, possibly even stronger. It's inside a church where people were there arguably to pray and to be close to their places of worship, to their God, and that's where the attack took place. So very, very
Louis,
high.
I'm just going to interrupt you there because I just want to remind our viewers that at this point we don't have a great deal of information on this attack. But we know that an investigation has been opened with a terrorist connection. If this happens to be a terrorist attack, and if it's confirmed that it is indeed an Islamist attack, again, this is something that we don't know yet at this point. Why are we seeing so many onslaughts of this nature in this country, in France?
Okay. Two ways to answer your question. First, because it's sadly very easy to carry them out. All you need is a lot of resolution and a butcher knife, and that's about it. So let me stress this. It's actually very, very easy to commit such a terrorist attack. People self-radicalize. It was the case for the attacker in Conflans-Sainte-Honorine 2 weeks ago. So people self-radicalize. They don't have to be part of a terrorist cell. They don't have to wait for orders, as was the case in 2015 and in 2016 from the Islamic State. People really take the arms by themselves. So sadly, very, very easy to carry out. A lot of potential targets, people in the streets, as happened in Marseille 2 years ago, this teacher in front of his high school, and now quite possibly people inside a church, if this indeed, as you say, is a terrorist attack.
But what you're saying doesn't add up in the sense that, for example, of course, we've seen similar attacks in the UK, but we've seen an increase in France. If it's so easy to pick up a knife and commit an attack like this, why is it happening more in France in comparison to other countries across the continent, if we have to make that unfortunate comparison?
Quite possibly, because the French authorities have sided with the Charlie Hebdo, with the people who have published those caricatures of the Prophet, which are seen as an insult for some Muslims, and an insult, grave enough for them to take, for some of them, a very small minority of them, to take action because of this. So because the authorities were so clear that the French state and the organization and the authorities were behind the freedom of speech and freedom to show those caricatures as a teaching object, as a pedagogical tool for students, for high school students, in order to learn the freedom of speech and expression as we see it in France. That makes France, sadly, a massive target for people who think otherwise and who think that what they think of freedom of speech and expression and what they believe is an insult to their religion is grave enough for them to commit those kinds of crimes. So
absolutely. And as you've just mentioned, this isn't something that's being discussed exclusively across the country's leadership. You know, these attacks have very much reinvigorated a debate across the country. As you mentioned, something you alluded to earlier, the freedom of speech versus what we're seeing from the French president, for example, Emmanuel Macron, who's essentially, as some are saying, butting heads with Islam. Is he adding fuel to the fire?
There is no fuel to be added to any fire. The fire is created by people who are more insulted by a caricature of a prophet than by everything that is done for the free. The free worshipping of Islam and any other religions in France, which is guaranteed by the state. It's actually quite easier to be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim in this country than in many other countries. So France doesn't have to be ashamed of the way it.
You say it's easier, but haven't we seen an increase of attacks against the Muslim community and anti-Semitic attacks in France across the recent years?
There has been seldom attacks by some people against the Muslim community. That is true. But you were mentioning the authorities and first and foremost President Macron. There is no policy against Islam in France. To say that, as President Erdogan in Turkey says, is actually adding fuel to a created fire. But there is no fire. There is no war from France to the Islamic community. There is nothing of the sort. Quite the opposite. Everybody is welcome in France to worship and to pray as long as they respect the rest of the rules, and freedom of speech is one of those rules. So there is absolutely no fire or no fuel to be added to any fire, because there are no attacks or organized attack on Islam by the French authorities.
Bernard Louis, on that note, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak to us here on France 24 on that breaking news story. Now, staying with France and the country's battle against a surging second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government's response, which was announced yesterday evening, a second nationwide lockdown. Now, as part of this measure, restaurants, bars and non-essential businesses will be shut down until the start of December. The difference this time, schools will remain open. Meanwhile, the country's scientific advisory board has expressed little confidence in these restrictions easing within a month. Now, we are expecting a statement from France's Prime Minister Jean Castex on the latest restrictions later this Thursday. That's at 6:30 p.m. Paris time, so do join us then. Now, but some of those new measures have been trickling in already, among them working from home 5 days a week. In the private sector, also the wearing of the mask will be extended to primary school children from the age of 6. Now, for more on this story, I'd like to bring in our international affairs editor, Philip Tell. Philip, thank you so much for being with us. Now, ahead of Macron's announcement last night, the Prime Minister Jean Castex held a series of meetings with the heads of all France's political parties. Are they united on this plan?
Well, one would like to think that in times of a national emergency like this one and a pandemic, that all parties would come together to work out a plan with which they could all move forward. Unfortunately, that is not the case here in France, where there's been widespread criticism from all the opposition parties over the way the government has been handling the coronavirus pandemic, not only now, but since it first broke out at the beginning of this year. Earlier this week, as you said, there was a meeting with the Prime Minister, Jean Castex, and the heads of all the main opposition parties. They came out of that meeting saying that we didn't get to hear any of the plans of the measures that the Prime Minister was proposing. He only asked us what we thought they should do, and there was really no discussion about that at all. So Christian Jacob, the head of the right-wing Republican Party, described the meeting as hallucinating and a cross between improvisation and panic. Olivier Faure of the Socialist Party said it was surrealist, and instead of bringing everyone together, it was exactly the opposite. And Marine Le Pen of the National Rally, formerly the National Front, of course, in France, said the government had reacted to the sanitary crisis in a totally erratic manner, with no anticipation and no strategy. So there is little support from the opposition towards what Emmanuel Macron has announced, i.e. a new lockdown for a month. Even within his inner circle, Francois Bayrou, who was part of his government to begin with, has said he's against the idea of a nationwide lockdown for a month.
Philip, it goes without saying that not everyone is happy with the latest measures, and of course there is discontentment about how France has handled, or mishandled, shall we say, this crisis.
Yeah, there's good and bad news. There are two inquiries taking place at the moment. One of them is an inquiry the government has called for. The findings of this should be given out by the end of this year. There's also a commission of inquiry that was set up into the coronavirus pandemic to find out what the government did right and what the government did wrong. Some of those findings are already being released. On the good side, positive, they say that the French hospitals coped very well during the first wave. Everyone received treatment. It was difficult in some hospitals, but no one was denied treatment when they were suffering from the coronavirus. And also, it's welcomed the setting up of a scientific council to propose sanitary measures and to manage the social and economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. But on the negative side, a lot of criticism over mixed messages, confusion from the government over the wearing of masks. Should they be worn or not? The earlier message was no, they're not needed. And then that suddenly changed to yes, they must be needed, or they are needed and they must be worn.
I suppose that's global, right?
Well, I think that basically it was because they didn't have the masks. So they weren't going to say you have to wear a mask, which would have obviously worried the population when those masks started being produced and arriving in chemist shops and in ordinary shops. Then they said, right, now you have to wear a mask. But the government's been accused down the line of misinformation and even not telling the truth. And there is also a lot of criticism of the testing methods in France, saying that the delay between the test and the result, like 10 days in some cases,
which we've experienced,
was
right?
far too long. Yes, far too long. And that was why the virus has sort of got out of control, much more than in Germany, where the testing was much more efficient. And of course, they have a much lower infection rate to that compared to France.
Philip, what do you think, putting your editorial hat on here, are we going to continue this lockdown beyond that December date that's been mentioned?
My own personal opinion, Salam, is that there are two things. First of all, yes, this lockdown is necessary, but no one knows how long it's going to last. I think the president doesn't want to say this could be a long-term lockdown for two reasons. Because A, he doesn't want to scare people too much that they're going to be kept at home, and it's going to be bad for businesses and the economy. And the second reason is that there's a lot of hope that this might come to an end before Christmas, and we'll all be able to spend Christmas together. But if you examine the bottom line, which is don't mix with people, don't see your grandparents, don't bring your children to visit them, don't gather in small groups inside. That is what everyone is going to do at Christmas. So it's hard to imagine that from locking the country down, they're going to open up and say everyone can celebrate Christmas together with their families in small groups, and then say in January, well, now we've got to lock down again because the virus has peaked again as a result of the activity over Christmas. I hope I'm proved wrong, I really do.
I hope so
but
too.
I think that is
round and
a strong
round circles we
possibility.
go, it seems, for the time being. And of course, if the lockdown continues through to Christmas, we'll see a greater impact on the country's economy, which is already in crisis. Philip Talcon, thank you now for being with us this Thursday. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24. More updates coming up very shortly.